Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time, Johnston fought in the Mexican-American War, got promoted, and then had to fight for his own promotion, resulting in him being the first West Point graduate to achieve a general's rank. Now we move through the tumultuous waters of secession with Johnston and his decision to join the Confederacy. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. Join the Patreon page, or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. As Quartermaster General, Johnston oversaw the feeding and equipping of the United States Army, working with a large budget of somewhere over $7 million. However, as he settled into his new job, the country was beginning to tear itself apart. Abraham Lincoln had been elected in November 1860, and now, at least one southern state made plans to hold a secession convention. Although his family owned slaves, Johnston himself wasn't a strong defender of slavery, but he also didn't see a world where whites and blacks could coexist in the same country without slavery. Years later, he wrote, "I often tried to convince them that the division of the country would give the slaves of the border southern states so near and safe a refuge that those states would soon cease to have slaves and be compelled to abandon the Confederacy." As one of Johnston's biographers stated, as Quartermaster General, Johnston's Dilemma was a professional one. He presided over the nation's storehouses of war material, and as the likelihood of civil war grew, he found himself in an increasingly delicate position. Southern by birth, Union by profession, he sought to meet all his obligations honorably, but determining what those obligations were was often difficult. The fact that Johnston's boss, Secretary of War Floyd, was also a Virginian made it even more difficult. Unlike Johnston, Floyd had no qualms about slavery or the importance of defending it. Not only did he show doubtful loyalty to the government he served, he was so casual in his record-keeping that before the year was out, he would be the object of a congressional investigation. Floyd, in an open effort to get samples or patterns for war material to southern states preparing to leave the Union, asked Johnston to send sample equipment to the governor of Georgia. Johnston sent some of the requested equipment, but not all. Within 2 weeks, Floyd had resigned and headed to Virginia to stir up secession in the state. Floyd's resignation caused a great deal of anxiety to Johnston. Friends could regularly find him pacing, deep in thought, and had a difficult time getting his attention as he stressed over the situation. One of Johnston's biographers summarized Johnston's beliefs during the crisis when he stated, "Johnston was not a proponent of slavery, and he doubted that secession was a legal right guaranteed by the Constitution, but he did believe in the right of revolution as a natural consequence of the principle of free government proclaimed by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. Every government, Johnston believed, was founded on the consent of the governed, and every community strong enough to establish and maintain its independence has a right to assert it." Secession was not merely a philosophical question for Johnston. For all of his agonizing, one thing was clear from the outset: his strongest loyalty was to Virginia, and he would serve his state in any way that he could. If Virginia remained in the Union, so would Johnston. If she left, Johnston would leave with her. Johnston followed the secession debate in Virginia closely, mainly because his brother was a delegate to the convention and kept him apprised of the debates. His brother was a Unionist, and as long as the secessionists stayed in the minority, he told Joe to stay in the U.S. Army. But as soon as the tide began to turn when Fort Sumter was fired upon, he signaled to Joe that secession was inevitable in Virginia and even voted to leave the Union when it appeared hopeless to stay in it. Joe Johnston waited a few days after the news of Virginia's secession before heading to the War Department on the morning of April 22, 1861, just like he did every morning, but this time he carried a letter of resignation. Outside Secretary of War Simon Cameron's office, Johnston ran into the Adjutant General Samuel Cooper. He asked Cooper to go in with him when he told the Secretary of his decision. Johnston was in tears when he said, "I must go with the South. I owe all that I am to the government of the United States. It has educated me and clothed me with honor. To leave the service is a hard necessity, but I must go." With his head bowed to hide his tears, Johnston left the room and went to tell Lydia the news. The two left their Alexandria home and boarded a train for Richmond the next day. They arrived in Virginia's capital on April 25th. Johnston sought out Virginia's governor, John Letcher, and offered his services to him. Robert E. Lee arrived 4 days earlier than Johnston and had been given the rank of Major General in command of Virginia's forces. On the recommendation of Lee, Letcher offered Johnston the same rank with control of Virginia's forces in and around Richmond. Johnston immediately accepted. For 2 weeks, Johnston busied himself with organizing troops as they came to the capital. However, the state of Virginia decided that they didn't need 2 major generals and offered Johnston a brigadier generalcy. Weeks before he resigned from the U.S. Army, the Secretary of War for the Confederacy, with its capital in Montgomery, Alabama, offered Johnston the rank of brigadier general in the Confederacy. When Virginia backed out of the major general's rank, Johnston realized that the war effort would be conducted by the Confederacy and not the individual states, and left with Lydia for Montgomery. Johnston became a brigadier general in the Confederacy, having long discussions with the provisional president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. He made it known that he desired a field command in Virginia, and the Secretary of War, Pope Walker, and the president obliged, sending him to Harpers Ferry to take command of the troops there. He left Lydia in Montgomery and headed for Virginia on May 22nd. Johnston arrived with his staff at Harpers Ferry. Among his staff was Colonel Edmund Kirby Smith and Major William Henry Chase Whiting, both future Confederate generals. When he arrived, he notified the senior colonel among the 9 regiments, Thomas Jonathan Jackson, that he would now take command of all the forces at Harpers Ferry. Jackson, a colonel of Virginia State Forces, didn't recognize Johnston's rank from the Confederate government, and it was not until Whiting showed Jackson that Robert E. Lee had signed off on the transfer of state troops to the Confederate government that Jackson relinquished his troops. Johnston wasn't the only general in Virginia commanding Confederate troops. Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard had a large force around Manassas Junction. The garrison at Harpers Ferry seemed to Johnston very vulnerable, and it was. Without a significant force to occupy the heights around the town and to watch the various crossings of the Potomac River, Johnston's force was susceptible to encirclement and capitulation. Johnston sent off multiple messages to Richmond asking for reinforcements and for outright orders to evacuate Harpers Ferry. Although reinforcements would trickle in, the order to evacuate didn't come. Lee and Samuel Cooper, the same man who accompanied Johnston into Simon Cameron's office to resign, both informed him that he could withdraw from Harpers Ferry, but only at his discretion. Johnston didn't like that wording. He wanted the responsibility of the evacuation to be placed on the Confederate War Department, not himself. Finally, in mid-June, Johnston ordered the abandonment of Harpers Ferry, pulling his regiment south toward Winchester, Virginia, the true gateway to the Shenandoah Valley, according to Johnston. Once the evacuation got into motion, Johnston received an official statement from Samuel Cooper to abandon Harpers Ferry if he deemed it necessary. Johnston detected rebuke in the message, and he wrote back to Cooper, defending himself against this official criticism, which he felt slighted over. While near Winchester, Johnston formed his newly dubbed Army of the Shenandoah into 5 brigades, one under Jackson, another under the West Point trained Bernard B., another West Pointer named Arnold Elzey from Maryland commanded the 3rd Brigade. Francis Bartow was the only brigade commander in Johnston's command not trained at West Point. He was a Georgia planter, a Yale graduate, and a Confederate congressman until he resigned to become a colonel. When Edmund Kirby Smith was promoted to brigadier general, Johnston formed newly arriving troops into a brigade for his former staff member. Jeb Stuart, a young cavalier and former member of the 1st U.S. Cavalry like Johnston, commanded Johnston's cavalry. Johnston thought a lot of Jackson, A.P. Hill, who commanded the 13th Virginia in his army, and Stuart, complimenting the 3 repeatedly, especially Stuart. At a little after midnight on July 18th, Cooper sent a telegram to Johnston alerting him of a Federal army attacking Beauregard near Manassas Junction. Beauregard was outnumbered, so Johnston needed to bring his entire force to Beauregard's assistance. The Army of the Shenandoah would slip away from the Federal force in its front, thanks to the screening done by Stuart's cavalry. The army moved slowly, especially compared to the regular army troops Johnston had been accustomed to over his decades in the military. He decided to board them on trains destined for Manassas, but the rail cars arrived sporadically. Jackson's brigade was headed to Beauregard by noon on July 19th, but the bulk of the force didn't move until the 20th. Johnston arrived in Manassas at noon on the 20th and went to see Beauregard. Before leaving the Shenandoah Valley, Johnston telegraphed Jefferson Davis asking who was in command when the armies linked up, Beauregard or himself. When he arrived at Beauregard's headquarters, the telegram was answered. Johnston was in command. Despite his seniority, Johnston gave Beauregard great leeway in the battle since Beauregard knew the terrain and the bulk of the force at Manassas was Beauregard's Army of the Potomac. When the engagement opened on July 21st, sounds of battle were emanating from the north at Matthews Hill, but Beauregard was convinced that the main attack would come on his right, that the sounds of battle to the left was just a feint for the real attack. The hours passed and the sounds to the north grew louder. The worried Johnston made up his mind. "The battle is there, and I am going," he said as he mounted his horse and told his staff to join him on the left. On top of Henry House Hill, he joined Jackson's brigade, perched atop the elevation, and watched as Union troops began to advance. He knew that the line needed to be bolstered to stop the Union advance and noticed a group of men to the right and behind Jackson's brigade. It was the 4th Alabama Regiment. Most of its officers were killed or wounded, and they were without a leader. Johnston rode up to the unit, put his hand on the flag, and said to the color bearer, "Sergeant, hand me your flag. I will lead you. Follow me." The sergeant replied, "General, don't take my colors from me. Tell me where to carry them, and I will place them there." Johnston let go of the flag and led the regiment to Jackson's right. Bernard Bee's brigade was being torn apart by Federal bullets, and Bee himself rode up to Johnston with tears in his eyes, saying, "General, my command is scattered, and I am alone." Johnston replied, "I know it was not your fault, General Bee, but don't despair. The day is not lost yet." Looking over to a disordered group of men, Johnston asked who they were. Bee replied, "They are South Carolinians." Johnston ordered Bee to rally them and lead them back into the fight. Bee rode off and urged the men back into the fight, telling them to imitate the Virginians and Jackson, standing like a stone wall. It was during his stay on Henry House Hill that Beauregard informed Johnston that as the commander of all the forces, he should leave the sections of the battle to subordinates like himself. Johnston would agree to the suggestion and made his headquarters at the house of Francis W. Lewis, behind the lines, and directed reinforcements to the Confederate left, sometimes taking them personally to the front and sometimes ordering an aide to place them. The Union troops finally broke, and as Johnston stated, the right of the Federal Army fled in wild confusion from the field toward Sudley Ford, while the center and left marched off hastily by the turnpike toward Centerville. Johnston tried to organize a pursuit, but the battle that sent the Union into a retreat also exhausted the Confederates and disorganized them. So, although some units were able to pursue, a total pursuit didn't materialize. Davis arrived at Johnston's headquarters as the sun was setting and asked how the battle went. Johnston said it was a victory, and Davis was thrilled. Davis, Johnston, and Beauregard rode over the battlefield and then went to Beauregard's headquarters. Davis, after getting details of the battle, ordered a pursuit, then changed his mind to order a reconnaissance in force for the next morning. The battle was the first major victory for the Confederacy, but it was a defeat to the reputation of Johnston. Beauregard, who was at Henry House Hill riding up and down the lines shouting encouragement to the troops, became famous and was touted in the newspapers as the man who won the Battle of Manassas. Although it didn't come immediately, other criticism, when the war was going against the Confederacy, lashed out at Johnston for not mounting a pursuit of the Federal Army. Johnston spent a great deal of time, especially in the post-war era, refuting these claims. In reality, a pursuit wasn't possible with the Confederates just as badly organized as the Federals, and even if they did get to Washington, it would be doubtful they could attack and capture the capital. As one of Johnston's biographers explained, as the relationship between Davis and Johnston soured in the coming months and years, each man tended increasingly to blame the other for past failures. The next few months after the First Battle of Manassas was a seminal moment for Johnston, for the worse. It created a toxic relationship between himself and the president, and it mostly stemmed over rank. Johnston was always touchy over rank and his authority. When orders arrived at his headquarters from Lee, he wrote them off as illegal since he outranked Lee in Confederate service. When Lee assigned Dabney H. Maury to Johnston's staff, Johnston fumed with anger that Lee would tell him what to do. He believed the only people he took orders from was the Adjutant General Samuel Cooper, the Secretary of War, and the President. What ruffled his feathers the most was a law put in place by the Confederate government outlining the rank designated in the Confederate Army. 3 laws were passed. The first ones were in March of that year, one outlining that there would be 5 brigadier generals in the Confederate service, and 2, their rank would be determined by their former commissions in the U.S. Army. So, whoever was senior in the old Army was senior in the Confederate Army. Shortly after those laws were passed, they raised the rank from brigadier general to full general, with the same stipulations of seniority. Reasonably, Johnston believed he was the senior general in the Army. On August 31st, about 5 weeks after the First Battle of Manassas, Davis put forward 5 men to be named full generals in the Confederate Army to the Confederate Senate. Johnston was among those men on the list, but Davis based their seniority on their graduating class from West Point and their standing within the class. Thus, in Davis's list, Samuel Cooper, class of 1815, came first, followed by Albert Sidney Johnston, class of 1826, then Robert E. Lee, who had graduated second in the class of 1829, then Johnston, who graduated 13th in that same class, and finally Beauregard, who had graduated in 1838. Davis later explained his rankings by claiming that since Lee and Johnston, among others, had entered state service before accepting commissions in the Confederate Army, the congressional legislation did not apply to them. Still later, he claimed that Johnston's commission as a brigadier general in the old Army was a staff rank and therefore did not count. Whatever his real reasons, he chose to interpret the legislation in his own way. The list and the seeming demotion in Johnston's eyes offended him greatly and cut him to the quick, signaling an attack on his public honor and reputation. He wrote a scathing letter to the president saying, "I now and here declare my claim that notwithstanding these nominations by the president and their confirmation by Congress, I still rightfully hold the rank of first general in the armies of the Southern Confederacy. The ranking seeks to tarnish my fair fame as a soldier and a man, earned by more than 30 years of laborious and perilous service. I had but this, the scars of many wounds, all honestly taken in my front and in the front of battle, in my father's revolutionary sword. It was delivered to me from his venerated hands, without a stain of dishonor. Its blade is still unblemished, as when it passed from his hand to mine. I drew it in the war, not for rank or fame, but to defend the sacred soil, the homes and hearths, the women and children, the men of my mother Virginia, my native South." Davis took the letter to a cabinet meeting and read it. He wrote a brief reply that characterized Johnston's actions as unbecoming and his statements as one-sided, but that was it. One of Johnston's biographers wrote, "Davis and Johnston never again corresponded with one another about this issue, nor did they speak of it when they met, but it was always there. Johnston never forgave Davis for the ranking, and Davis never forgave Johnston for his outburst. The seeds of a lifelong feud would flourish in the ensuing years until that feud defined their whole attitude toward one another." In late September, Davis came north to Fairfax Courthouse to meet with Johnston and his 2 corps commanders, Beauregard and Gustavus W. Smith. In the meeting between the 4 men, Davis wanted an offensive into the north and asked what Johnston needed to launch such a campaign. Smith said at least 50,000 men, but Beauregard and Johnston claimed they needed 60,000 men. The army as it stood only numbered around 40,000. Davis asked where those troops would come from to augment the army. Johnston suggested stripping Georgia and the Carolinas of all available troops, saying, "Success here in Virginia saves everything. Defeat here loses all." Davis couldn't pull those troops away and decided against an offensive that fall. Johnston pulled his army back to Centerville and settled in for the winter. However, also that fall, Johnston would have another run-in with the Confederate authorities, but not Davis. This time it was the Secretary of War, Judah Benjamin, an ardent supporter of Davis. Johnston wanted to know if the War Department planned on contracting out building huts for the winter for the troops. Although Benjamin said that the responsibility was on Johnston, Benjamin dispatched 2 contractors to Johnston. The contractors spoke with Johnston and agreed to have the huts ready by December. However, as the contractors were outside Beauregard's headquarters, an unidentified major said that the troops could build the huts themselves. The contractors took this as an official statement and left for Richmond, both them and Johnston thinking the situation was handled. Things became heated between Johnston and Benjamin when the 2 accused one another of not fulfilling their end of the situation. However, the huge disagreement came when Davis wanted to make good the law giving the president the ability to accept regiments from different states and to appoint officers to command them. Davis interpreted this as meaning to place the regiments of each state into brigades to create state brigades and even state divisions if possible. So he ordered Johnston to reorganize the army, and Johnston delayed. Johnston argued that with the enemy so close he could never have the opportunity to brigade the various regiments into state brigades. Davis and Benjamin repeatedly asked him to do so, and Johnston kept saying the moment wasn't right. When Johnston's staffer, Chase Whiting, defended Johnston to Benjamin, Davis ordered Whiting away from Johnston and to be sent to the Shenandoah Valley with Stonewall Jackson. Davis would eventually relent, but it only caused more bad blood between the two men. Then, as enlistments were coming up over the winter, Davis and Benjamin sought to keep as many men in the Army as possible by granting furloughs and individual transfers if soldiers would stay in the Army. Instead of working through Johnston, Benjamin sent his own recruiters into Johnston's camps with furlough papers and undermined Johnston's authority. Johnston wrote to the president complaining of Benjamin's meddling, but the appeal had no effect. During that winter, another event depressed Johnston. Beauregard was transferred to the Western Theater. Johnston would divide the two halves of his army into 3 divisions, one under Gustavus W. Smith, another under James Longstreet, and the other under Daniel Harvey Hill. His army hadn't grown much, hovering around 40,000, but the Union Army, under Johnston's friend George McClellan, numbered around 100,000 men, and the spring campaign season was about to begin. On February 19, 1862, Johnston was in Richmond to meet with Davis and the cabinet. The meeting lasted 7 hours, where they mostly discussed moving the army closer to Richmond, since other troops could not be spared to come to Virginia. When the discussions ended, Johnston and the president came away with different ideas on what was agreed upon. Johnston thought the plan was to fall back as soon as practicable. Davis thought the plan was to hold on until it became absolutely necessary to withdraw. Later that night at a dinner party, Johnston was asked about Judah Benjamin, and the general declared that the Confederacy could never win with him as Secretary of War. On Johnston's way back to Centerville, he met an acquaintance who asked if it was true that the cabinet had discussed the evacuation of Centerville. Johnston asked where he heard the rumor, and he said from the wife of a cabinet member. Johnston fumed over the lack of secrecy and silently vowed to never trust Davis with military secrets. In early March, Jeb Stuart's cavalry notified the Army commander that there was a buildup of Union forces in their front, and Johnston concluded that this was the major movement by the Union Army of the Potomac. By March 13th, the Army was safely behind the Rappahannock River. This came as a surprise to Davis because Johnston, fearing a leak in the communications, didn't notify the president of the evacuation until it was already underway. Davis would make Robert E. Lee the conduit through which much of the military correspondence would flow from the president, and in such a position, Lee and Davis visited Johnston south of the Rapidan River. They discussed strategy, and Johnston wanted to give ground in order to concentrate his forces, but Lee wanted Johnston to engage with the enemy as far away from the strategic center as possible. When a buildup of Union forces began near Fort Monroe on the peninsula in Virginia formed by the James and York Rivers, Davis and Lee wanted Johnston to divide his force and send a large portion to Richmond. Johnston obviously balked at the thought and suggested sending the whole army to Richmond. Eventually they settled on about 10,000 troops. Johnston would warn, "We cannot win without concentration." By April, the Union Army under Johnston's friend George McClellan was on the peninsula, and Johnston's army was brought to Richmond. On April 14th, the discussion between Davis, Lee, Johnston, Hill, Longstreet, Smith, and the newly appointed Secretary of War George Randolph lasted hours as Johnston argued to withdraw to Richmond and fight a climactic battle outside the city. Lee and Davis wanted Johnston to engage with McClellan on the peninsula, where the Union's numbers were minimized by the small front they could occupy. Johnston grew concerned over the Union Navy possibly outflanking his position on land and defended himself vigorously. In the end, Davis and Lee ordered Johnston to fight it out on the peninsula. The stage was set for the Peninsula Campaign, pitting two friends and their armies against one another.